In 1811, Napoleon controls Europe, from the Mediterranean to the Niemen River. He's counting on Russian support to fight the British. But Alexander doesn't approve of Napoleon's expansionist strategy, and irrespective of their treaties, allows the British access to his ports. For Napoleon, Russia's behavior makes it an enemy of France. Caulaincourt, his closest advisor, tries to convince him not to embark on another devastating campaign, but Napoleon will hear nothing of it. In June 1812, the Grande Armée crosses the Niemen River and enters Russian territory in a declaration of war. Napoleon's aim is a lightning campaign. Alexander chooses to avoid conflict and allows the Grande Armée to invade his land. General Kutuzov is named as supreme commander of the Russian army. The French continue their march on Moscow in the intense heat, but the Russians strip the land bare as part of a scorched earth policy. Ill health and desertions decimate the Grande Armée. Despite his victory at the Battle of Borodino, also called the Battle of La Moskova, Napoleon cannot annihilate his enemy. The Grande Armée arrives in a deserted Moscow. The city's governor, Count Rostopchin, has decided to burn it down to leave nothing to the French.
Get down!
The Russians are ready to do anything to destroy the Grande Armée.
The artillery is in place, the cavalry too.
Lariboisiere tells me the stables are burning and the fire may spread to the arsenal.
400 crates of gunpowder? The slightest spark could blow the lot.
We don't have a moment to lose. We have to leave the Kremlin.
I'm the first sovereign for more than 2 centuries to have conquered this fortress. There is no question.
This isn't about retreating. It's about keeping you safe.
The fire spreads, and it's impossible to predict where or when it'll stop. But Napoleon wants to prove his determination to the Tsar.
Savages. Burning their city like this. This is not how a war is fought!
The results of the fire in Moscow were impressive. More than 60% of the wooden constructions in the city burned down.
For 6 days, the flames are fanned by the wind and destroy the university library, palace, and theaters. They reduce countless wooden constructions to ashes. Houses, warehouses, shops, and churches. The governor of Moscow, Count Rostopchin, writes to his wife, "By the time you receive this letter, Moscow will be reduced to ashes. Forgive me."
Rostopchin undoubtedly was responsible for the fire of Moscow, and he actually ordered a number of his junior officials to set fire in various places in the city. It is based on the idea that you will deprive the enemy of accommodation, comfort, and you will also persuade him that this is a war to the death.
The fires in Moscow were a catastrophe for Alexander I. Later on, he would say that it was a fundamental element. He said, "The fires in Moscow lit up my soul." It was a real trauma for him.
In abandoning Moscow, Alexander loses the support of the Russian people and starts to doubt his generals. Devastated, he confides in his favorite sister, the Grand Duchess Ekaterina Pavlovna.
Alexander. How could you allow the Corsican to take residence up in Moscow?
Kutuzov led me to believe that our armies triumphed in Borodino. He tricked me and...
You weren't responsible, brother.
I didn't want to listen to Kutuzov. I was just giving in to the general consensus.
They're accusing you of betraying the honor of the country and ruining the people. All the classes are united now in their condemnation of you.
I don't have the skills.
Stop doubting yourself.
I am badly advised, badly served, and facing an adversary who has the whole of Europe at his disposal.
Do you intend to abandon your empire to this scoundrel? That monster who wanted to marry me, to whom you almost promised my hand?
Don't worry. I will refuse any negotiation with him while there is a single French soldier present on Imperial soil. And if my dynasty ever ceases to reign, I will grow a beard. I will go and eat potatoes in deepest Siberia, because I love potatoes.
Gradually, the Tsar ends up laying the blame on the French for the fires, in an attempt to reunite the population.
Moskovskiej guberni. Wrag roda человеческого. Наказание Господне за наши грехи. Дьявольское воплощение. Француз, злодей, занял Москву и поверг ее в кровь и огонь.
The fires in Moscow were a new catalyst in terms of the resistance of the Russian people, because these invaders had taken over the historic capital of Mother Russia and set it on fire.
So long as Napoleon didn't succeed in doing that, Alexander would fight. And there was no reason for him to make peace just because Napoleon had got to Moscow. And he knew that the longer Napoleon stayed in Moscow, the more difficult the French position would become.
Torrential rain eventually quenches the fires. In the heart of this wasted city, Napoleon is cradling illusions that the Tsar will beg for mercy and ask for peace, and that it will only be a matter of days. There's no question of weakening. The arsonists are arrested in their hundreds and escorted to the scaffold. Convicts, middle-class bourgeoisie, Russian policemen, most of them plead innocence, but the order is given to kill with bayonets those who attempt to run away. Sergeant Bourgogne remembers. Until Moscow, I had always been a fairly carefree person who was above the problems burdening us. It seemed that the more danger and suffering there was, the more there needed to be glory and honor.
The majority of accounts and stories from soldiers who arrived in Moscow describe scenes of pillage. After the fires, Napoleon left people to their own devices. He allowed the city to be pillaged, and his soldiers amassed a wide range of objects, including antiques, jewelry and paintings.
There was meat to be found, vegetables and drink, and there were a lot of stories that showed that the soldiers who were able to break into the cellars of the Moscow bourgeoisie found plenty of alcohol there, emerging completely incapable of doing their jobs as soldiers.
Day 8 in Moscow, and no news of Alexander. Napoleon finds a way to contact him.
Sir, Captain Yakovlev.
Ah, Captain. I hear your family is one of the most respectable in the city. And that you tried to run away, but you didn't have time.
You are well informed.
In exchange for a laissez-passer for you, your mistress, and your child, would you please deliver this letter to your sovereign?
I cannot guarantee that he will agree to read it.
Do your best.
The Emperor hopes to push the Tsar into an honorable capitulation.
Alexander, my brother, I'm a peace-loving man. It's not with pleasure that I am camped here. I miss my wife and son, and I wish you no harm. But those who serve you are only seeking personal glory. I am convinced that if nobody comes between us, our former friendship will soon return, and all this unhappiness will be over.
He thinks I'm being influenced by my entourage. It is I and I alone who refuses to grant him peace. You didn't know that I gave an order to not embark under any circumstances on any negotiations with Bonaparte?
Your Majesty, I am but the messenger.
Take him to the Peter and Paul fortress, where he can await a verdict for treason.
I was forced to do it.
For Alexander I, signing a peace treaty would probably have been a suicide mission. He would have been removed from the throne and replaced, and Alexander I knew that very well. The Tsar was categorical. Not only did he not want to negotiate, but he didn't even want anyone to speak with the French emissaries on his behalf.
And above all, Napoleon considered that having taken the historic capital of Russia, he had won the war, and now it was just down to thrashing out a peace treaty.
While he waits for Alexander to capitulate, Napoleon manages French affairs from Moscow. He also organizes the daily lives of his soldiers to keep them busy and to lift their spirits. As such, he reopens the French theater in Moscow, but only for the troops stationed in the city. With Moscow having been largely destroyed by the fire, the majority of the soldiers have to camp out in the suburbs. Outside the city walls, they are much more exposed to the enemy and are attacked by partisans, helped by armed women and peasants determined to support their fathers and husbands and to avenge their brothers and sons.
In terms of the partisans, there's only one thing you can say. They were army brigades made up of Cossacks and Hussars. It was the biggest force that had ever fought the French.
The Cossacks came from the south of the country and formed communities of free men. They had preserved a certain autonomy and used unusual tactics inherited from the people of the steppes. They were used to harass the enemy, attack its flanks and rear guard, and to damage communication lines night and day. These tens of thousands of Cossacks inspired terror in their enemies and wore down their spirits like diabolical apparitions.
Alexander still refuses to answer. What ridiculous stubbornness. He will regret this. I'm sending you back to St. Petersburg, Caulaincourt. You will see the Emperor Alexander and you'll make peace. He knows you.
He will refuse to see me. He knows that time is on his side. Winter is coming.
Oh, stop with the winter. The fall is milder here than in Fontainebleau.
Don't count on it, sir. Winter will come, and in the state we're in, it will hit us like a bomb.
Continue.
We need to re-equip the army. We need sheepskins, gloves, hats, fur-lined boots, the things one needs for winter.
I'm listening.
Many of our men have already perished between the Niemen River and La Moskova, and believe me, we are lacking so much. We haven't prepared the winter horseshoes, so how will they manage with the artillery, with the diseased and wounded? The weather is still good. Let us profit from it and leave Moscow.
Leaving Moscow would be admitting defeat. I understand your scruples about meeting Alexander. While Russia is so devastated, if that's the case, go and see Kutuzov.
He will not give in either.
Then I'll send Lauriston, and he will have the honor of having made peace and having saved the crown of your friend, Alexander. You're dismissed, Caulaincourt.
There is no question of a Russian capitulation. In sending the Marquis of Lauriston to negotiate with General Kutuzov, Napoleon hopes above all to save face and save his troops. Like Caulaincourt before him, Lauriston had been the French ambassador in St. Petersburg.
The Emperor, my master, would have liked to have handled Moscow like Vienna and Berlin. But in setting it ablaze, your compatriots have destroyed the work of several centuries.
Милые дамы, через несколько минут я полностью ваш.
We have never made war in this way. Our soldiers are not arsonists.
Unfortunately, the people are convinced of the contrary. For the Russians, this war is as devastating as a Tatar invasion.
You cannot compare Napoleon to Genghis Khan.
Oh, you're right. Genghis Khan was never so disrespectful as to turn our churches into stables.
Your peasants have demonstrated extreme cruelty towards their prisoners. They scald them and impale them alive. Their ferocity is contrary to the rules of war and...
Is our regular army also so dishonorable?
No, but...
Alas, I cannot control the serfs. They need to be completely re-educated.
Let us at least organize an exchange of prisoners. The Emperor sincerely desires to put an end to this quarrel between two such generous nations. Let us find a compromise.
A compromise? Do you want me to be damned by posterity?
This war cannot go on any longer. Let us try to conclude an armistice.
Oh, I am absolutely forbidden from speaking that word.
3 times Alexander refused to enter into negotiations, and it paid off. A battle-weary Napoleon was forced on the 19th of October to announce his withdrawal.
Napoleon is not a complete idiot. He can add up the realities of military logistics. And he knows what will happen to him if he stays in Moscow over the winter and all his horses die, as they undoubtedly will. And he imagines, again, not entirely realistically, what might happen in Paris if the emperor is cut off from his capital for 4 months at the other end of Europe.
In his last letter from the Kremlin, the emperor announces his retreat. This letter reveals a man overwhelmed. He had arrived in Moscow at the top of his power, but he is leaving in a weakened state. It is the start of an unstoppable decline. Nobody had ever seen him express himself with such emotion, even when he talked of his love for the Empress or his son. Moscow has floored him. The Grande Armée prepares to leave the city. Among us, there was a young and attractive person who, it was said, belonged to one of Moscow's first families. In a moment of madness, she had become involved with one of our superior officers. And in another bigger moment of madness, she followed him in the retreat. The fatal convoy. A ragtag caravan of all kinds of vehicles, stuffed with the most unlikely bounty. Whole bookcases of beautiful volumes, old masters rolled up for easier transportation. Despite the premonition of misery they bear, each is carrying their share of the spoils, along with several pounds of sugar, rice, biscuits, and liquor to head off the future deprivation. Behind the fighters come the non-combatants of the Grande Armée, ambulance drivers, engineers, blacksmiths, bakers, farriers, cooks, women and children, all of whom have also profited from their stay in Moscow. The presence of the non-combatants mingling with the rear guard will soon prove to be a terrible handicap.
Kutuzov's strategy is, in a way, simple. He believes that the climate will help to destroy the French army. He knows that his Cossacks, backed by regular light cavalry, will force the French army to stay on the roads, make it impossible for the French to forage, and therefore doom most of them to starvation.
And that was no doubt Kutuzov's masterstroke, obliging him to retrace his steps. And indeed, a few days after leaving Moscow, the soldiers were crossing the battlefields of Borodino that nobody had had the time to clean up.
The remains of the Battle of Borodino. We wondered what had been the point of this victory, writes Sergeant Bourgogne, this battle already celebrated by the number of victims whose lives it took. As far as the eye could see, there was an almighty stench with legs, arms and heads poking out of the earth. The rain had left open graves. There is nothing more pitiful than all those dead who had barely kept their human form 52 days after the battle. Grande Armée Dr. Heinrich von Roos remembers, everywhere we camped or on the road, when the wounded needed to get down from their transport or to redo their bandages, they were abandoned by cruel cooks, arrogant women with their newly found riches, or merciless brothers in arms. I saw some of them moaning and begging for help on the road. Like Armand de Caulaincourt had sadly predicted, the winter arrives without warning in early November. Temperatures fall below -20 degrees Celsius. The horses have not been shod for ice, and as a result, every movement makes them slip, and they become exhausted. The loads in the wagons need to be lightened, forcing the Grande Armée to offload their booty. Moscow is already little more than a distant memory.
I think the Grande Armée was not prepared for the winter because Napoleon never expected to fight a winter campaign.
Studies have shown that a combination of 3 factors, exhaustion, stress, and cold, wreak havoc on a soldier's metabolism. So much so that if they receive the equivalent of 500 calories a day, their body can only absorb a fraction. The harassment tactics of the Russians, combined with the weather and rationing of supplies, therefore accelerates the onset of malnutrition, amplifies the famine, and multiplies the number of those dying of hunger.
From the start, he expected to defeat the Russian army within 2 months. That was the whole logic of his strategy. But he gets drawn into a longer campaign.
On the ground, the men are freezing. They're so hungry that they slit open the bellies of abandoned horses, collect their blood, and cook it for food. The Russians profit from this terrible situation to attack their prey. The Grande Armée falls apart, while in Paris the balance of power is shifting. On the night of the 23rd of October in Paris, General Mallet and a few of his men go to the prefecture, seize the Minister of Police, Savary, and take him to La Force prison. Mallet and his accomplices then go to the High Command in Place Vendôme without encountering the slightest resistance. Mallet has spread a rumor that the emperor has been killed at the gates of Moscow. He wants to set up a provisional government and put an end to the war. The emperor's popularity in Paris is waning. When Napoleon hears of this attempt at a coup d'etat, he only has one thing in mind.
I must return to Paris now. I cannot allow emotions to spiral out of control, even if this business only lasted a few hours. There are always wise men to continue the work of fools.
You cannot return to France before your army.
They were ready to sound the death knell at Saint-Roch to announce my demise. And nobody even thought to designate Marie-Louise as regent. And I have a son, a successor. But they have forgotten him, Caulaincourt. They have forgotten the King of Rome.
While Napoleon thinks about returning home, the massacre continues on the ground. In mid-November, only 42,000 men remain of the 104,000 who left Moscow. The others have perished from hunger, exhaustion, and disease, or have deserted, some of the stragglers falling into the hands of Cossack detachments, and others dying in combat. Smolensk is no longer very far away.
Napoleon hoped to pass more to the south, on the richer lands that hadn't been touched, where they might find food. But he was prevented from doing this by the Russian army, which forced him to return the way he had come, via Smolensk.
They all hoped to find food and fodder for the horses in Smolensk, thanks to the levies imposed on the local population. The survivors believe that the end of their hardships is close.
In Smolensk, Napoleon had given orders for provisions so the men would have something to eat when they arrived. But the troops he'd left there had already started on these reserves, which meant that there wasn't enough to fulfill the needs of the returning army.
It's a huge disappointment. Starving and weakened, the Grande Armée has to leave Smolensk. It's but a shadow of what it once was, and the Cossacks profit from this vulnerability to attack its flanks. This constant harassment forces Napoleon to keep his surviving troops on a route that has been stripped bare. As for Kutuzov, he has 80,000 men in pursuit and is getting dangerously close to Napoleon's position. He's supported in the north by General Wittgenstein, who has 40,000 troops and is preparing to bear down on the middle of the French army, while General Chichagov completes the Russian encircling of the French with 27,000 troops and 100 cannon upstream of the Berezina River. The noose is tightening, especially as Chichagov has taken a key position. He's controlling the only crossing point of the Berezina River, the bridge at Borisov. The Grande Armée is exhausted and its numbers are reducing a little more each day. The wind is like a razor blade, cutting to the marrow. The ice seals their eyelids and their fingers stick to the metal of their guns. It makes their legs as fragile as alabaster. The joints in their feet and hands break at the slightest pressure, yet they feel no pain. To remove the clothes of the fallen, one cannot wait until their bodies are frozen stiff. More than one finds himself stripped before breathing his last. Sergeant Bourgogne remembers. Exhausted by this inhuman march, I left the ranks and joined up with a few soldiers. I had one potato left to eat. In a fit of selfishness for which I never forgave myself, I didn't share it with my friends who were dying of hunger. But it was frozen solid. My teeth slid across it, unable to take a bite. I was taken by an overwhelming desire to sleep, but I knew that it would be fatal. I had to move, march, and stay awake, so I went back on my way. Bourgogne is disorientated by the blizzard and the darkness. The snow covers his footprints. He marches like this until dawn, looking for his regiment. He can no longer feel his limbs, nor the rats gnawing at him. At dawn, he discovers the remains of a convoy and the hope of finding something to eat. Something to keep him alive for a few more hours on this miserable earth.
Подожди. Не стреляй.
Sergeant Bourgogne remembers. One has to have felt the rage of hunger to understand. We would have eaten the devil had he been cooked. Hatred mingles with compassion. But the Russian soldiers are also deprived. A prisoner means one more mouth to feed. Choices have to be made.
As the troops progressed, they left behind the stragglers and the sick, who were immediately taken prisoner.
The prisoners' fates varied depending on their circumstances. Those who were lucky enough, if you can put it like that, to be handed over to the regular army were escorted east to stop them returning to fight. Others met an even worse fate. They had everything taken from them and were turned over to village communities, who often put them to death.
Alexander is shocked by these revelations and does everything he can to forbid such practices, promising a reward for soldiers and peasants who hand prisoners over to a civil authority to have them locked up. But the abuse of prisoners isn't just limited to the Russians. In Smolensk, 600 Russian prisoners considered unable to march are executed by the French. Alexander's getting impatient. He knows the end game is coming. The Berezina is his one chance, and he gives his men the order to capture Napoleon.
The Battle of the Berezina is a battle that made a real impact on Napoleon's campaign. The name refers to a river, which was an obstacle for Napoleon's army. And Kutuzov thought that the Berezina would be the obstacle that would enable him to surround Napoleon and seize his army. The army that came from Moscow approached the Berezina River and hoped to cross it at a place called Borisov, where there was a bridge.
Under orders from Napoleon, Marshal Oudinot boldly swoops upon the town of Borisov, capturing it without difficulty. But the Russians have burned the bridge, destroying the Grande Armée's only route over the Berezina and out of Kutuzov's pincer movement. They need another route, urgently. One of Marshal Oudinot's units lost on the other bank comes across a peasant soaked up to his armpits. They deduce there must be a place where the river can be forded nearby. They interrogate the peasant, who tells them that it is nearby the village of Studianka, 8 miles north of Borisov. But Napoleon is not the only one to understand the strategic importance of the bridge at Borisov. Chichagov is defending the west bank with 30,000 men and 100 cannon. At the same time, Kutuzov is coming up behind the Napoleonic forces with his 80,000 troops. And he asked General Wittgenstein to complete the circle with a 30,000-strong force. But Napoleon predicts their charade.
Oudinot and Mouton, you will discreetly advance your troops towards Studianka. When night falls, you will build 2 bridges there. One for the artillery and the wagons, and the other for the infantry and cavalry.
But, sir, if...
Wait, Lauriston. At the same time here, downstream from Borisov, visible to the enemy, we will rebuild the bridge there. But, contrary to what the Russians will think, we won't use it. And while Chichagov concentrates most of his troops here, our troops will cross the river here, in Studianka.
The apparently helpless situation of the Grande Armée did nothing to disturb the Emperor's serenity. Everyone else was in a panic, writes Caulaincourt. But Napoleon was bigger than that. Hope intoxicated him more than the most terrible setback could drag him down.
Napoleon had the great idea of using a decoy, which in fact worked very well, because he ordered Borisov to be retaken by the French and ordered a lot of ostentatious construction in Borisov to make the Russians think he was going to cross there. But at night, secretly, in the dark, he ordered the transfer of his men to begin, in the wake of Eblé's bridge builders, who were in charge of the construction of the 2 famous bridges at Studianka.
If Napoleon's army cannot cross the Berezina, they have no choice but to surrender. France's fate hangs in the balance. Napoleon goes to the riverbank several times to observe the fires in the Russian camp. Their number and density reassure him that his plan is working. The Russians think that the main crossing point will be in Borisov, but Studianka is only a couple of hours' march away for a trained army. The risk of being caught and attacked remains very real. The western bank of the Berezina at Studianka must be protected. Napoleon orders the 50 members of General Corbineau's cavalry to swim across the river. Each horse also carries an infantryman on its neck. 400 soldiers join the brave cavalrymen on makeshift rafts. There is a constant back and forth between the 2 banks. In parallel, the weakened Russian forces of General Kornilov are crushed by 50 cannon being directly commanded by Napoleon. The western bank is soon cleared. Two hours later, they start to install the uprights. General Eblé leads the way, throwing himself into the icy water. Eblé's heroic bridge builders remove their clothes and get down to work, ignoring the huge blocks of ice floating in the river. These blocks are as sharp as blades, making their task particularly dangerous. The bridge builders are up to their shoulders in the water, installing the uprights. Many lives are lost, abandoned to the current. They are soon replaced by other brave men. By the end of the morning, the infantry bridge is complete. By 1 p.m., Oudinot's troops are crossing the newly constructed bridge. In a hurry to reinforce the western bank, they hasten across the wobbly construction. By 4 p.m., the second bridge is completed beside the first. By the evening, almost 10,000 soldiers have crossed the bridge and reached the west bank of the river. Night falls, and they must take advantage of the darkness. Wagons and cannon are brought across the river. The bridge vibrates and 3 times gives way, failing to support the weight. The loyal bridge builders jump back in the water to repair or replace the broken parts. It's a race against time, and the temperature is minus 30 degrees as they fix the bridge in under 3 hours. Napoleon and his general staff crossed to the West Bank later on, continuing to encourage the never-ending flow across the bridge. This morning, Napoleon's orders were clear. Only ordered army troops are to cross. The rest, hawkers, stragglers, and non-combatants, are roughly pushed back. After several days of solitary marching, Sergeant Bourgogne eventually meets up again with his companions. He joins non-combatants and stragglers who have been waiting since the previous day to cross the bridge. One witness wrote, "Those who entered Russia to fight barbarism and introduce civilization are now nothing more than debris, pathetic ghosts." During the night of 27th of November, something incredible happens. There's virtually nobody pushing to cross the bridge. The way across is clear. But an exhausted and feverish Bourgogne is asleep beside a fire. At dawn, he is woken by cannon fire. He then understands that to be in with a chance of survival, he absolutely must cross the bridge. Better die from a cannonball than from cold or hunger. At 7 a.m., completely alone, he gets up, takes his gun, and without saying a word to anyone, goes towards the bridge. His limbs are frozen, his bones as fragile as glass, making walking extremely difficult. Sergeant Bourgogne remembers. "I saw women demonstrating admirable courage, tolerating pain. Some even put men to shame, men who did not know how to tolerate adversity with bravery and resignation. I crossed the Berezina River on a totally deserted bridge. When I reached the other side, I saw on my right a large shack made from planks. It was there that the Emperor had slept, and where he still was." Bourgogne reaches the West Bank and joins his comrades. But little does he know that 4 hours later, the nightmare would begin all over again. On the same side of the river, General Chichagov and 27,000 men are swooping down on Oudinot's troops. The fight is a terrible one. Oudinot must remain in control of the Western Bank at all costs, it being a vital crossing point. At the same moment, on the East Bank, General Wittgenstein is leading 40,000 soldiers to attack Marshal Victor's 10,000 troops, as the rearguard has stayed near to Studyanka. Napoleon's army is trapped. It is panic on the Eastern Bank. In the middle of the fighting and cannon fire, thousands of stragglers and non-combatants who have been waiting for 2 days race pell-mell onto the ramps leading to the bridges. Terrified men, women and children are shot down by cannon fire, trampled by horses, or fall from the slippery wooden structures. Grande Armée surgeon Baron de Larrey remembers, "The horror was everywhere. The strongest killed the weakest, who were crushed beneath the feet of the crowd. The air was filled with terrible screams. A few managed to swim across, but others drowned, and more still were trapped by the floating blocks of ice." The ferocious fighting continues until 11 p.m. to the sound of cannon and gunfire in a terrible snowstorm. At the end of one exhausting day, heavy with loss, the Russian armies are pushed back, and Napoleon controls both sides of the Berezina.
At the Battle of Berezina, Napoleon took a decision as head of the army. It was the only option open to him. He wanted to save his army and continue his military campaign. The stragglers did not want to cross the bridges at night, and the Russians were coming, so he gave the order to burn the bridges.
During the night, General Eblé urges the survivors on the east bank to cross the last bridge that can still be crossed.
Eblé was a remarkable man. By that, I mean he was devoted to his cause, extremely devoted to the emperor, but at the same time, he was a deeply humane person. And when Napoleon gave him the order to burn the bridges, he knew very well what that meant. It meant that thousands of people would be left to the violence of the Cossacks.
The fatal command: burn the bridges. Seeing the Cossacks approaching, General Eblé accepts that he must do it, but he is sick at heart. In the first flames, there is a mad scramble to cross the bridge. The stragglers are running all over the place. A disordered and confused crowd of people stumbles around. 12,000 stragglers and non-combatants and around 3,000 fighters are desperately fighting to survive. As seen by the powerless spectators on the right bank, this is a spectacle of horror and suffering. It's a free-for-all, these unfortunate souls caught between two evils, cornered by the Cossacks who are not giving an inch and trapped by the flaming bridges. There is no way forward and no way back. In the rush, the bridge collapses. Men, women, and children are consumed by flames or drowned in the icy water. The death toll is catastrophic. Kutuzov missed his chance at the Berezina. 7,000 of Napoleon's soldiers and 2,000 of his officers, his Imperial Guard, his marshals, and his high command managed to escape 3 Russian armies of many more men.
Napoleon had lost no battles, but he had lost his entire campaign. More than 600,000 were gone either dead or taken prisoner in Russia. That was the result of this campaign.
In fact, for the Russians, the Battle of Berezina was a failure because they wanted to capture Napoleon.
The Battle of the Berezina is both a disaster for the French army and a victory, indeed in many ways its proudest moment. Of course, thousands of French soldiers die at the Berezina. But what really matters is that the core of the French army escapes. And by the core of the French army, I mean its generals, its staff officers, its vital professional cadre. Napoleon was able to put together a very formidable new army in 1813. So it was a French victory of a sort.
On the 5th of December, day 48 of the retreat, Napoleon, who can no longer bear not knowing what is happening in the capital, takes the decision to return to Paris. He orders Caulaincourt to accompany him. In 10 days and 10 nights, they reach Germany. After crossing the Duchy of Warsaw, they stop over in Germany. Incognito, they hope.
As soon as I'm back in Paris, I'll reassure my people and explain to them the reasons for our battles. Caulaincourt. Events have proven you right, Caulaincourt. But I didn't lead this campaign like some Don Quixote in search of adventures, no. The only difference between me and other sovereigns is that problems stand in their way, whereas I like to overcome them, especially when the rewards are grand and noble, worthy of me and the nation. If it hadn't been for the weather, the Russians would have capitulated. Look, our disasters were limited to a week. We stayed a week too long in Moscow, but nothing is over. We'll prove ourselves yet.
Do you not think we should...
I know what you think of me, Caulaincourt, but I have no more ambition. I'm too old for it, believe me. I yearn to rest. But I want to finish my oeuvre.
Übrigens.
Ja?
Wir sind jetzt schon 2 Stunden hier. Wo bleiben denn die Pferde?
Pferde sind gleich gesattelt, mein Herr.
Ich kann doch kaum glauben, dass dieser Post über kein Pferd verfügt. Und dass Meilenwein kein zu finden ist.
Die Zeiten sind hart, mein Herr. Das ist Napoleons Schuld. Gerade heute Morgen haben uns Plünderer schon wieder 2 Reitpferde gestohlen.
Convinced the innkeeper is deliberately holding them up, Caulaincourt fears an ambush.
Ich weiß, dass du Pferde hast. Wo versteckst du sie?
Ich sagte, ich habe keine.
Wenn sie in
ich hab
5
doch
Minuten nicht gesattelt sind, dann schlitz ich dich auf.
In Ordnung, kommt sofort.
Three days later, Napoleon enters the Tuileries. Meanwhile, the Grande Armée continues to beat a retreat through the snowy, marshy and icy forests, still pursued and harassed by the Cossacks and Kutuzov's troops.
The French population had no doubts about Napoleon after 1812. In fact, it didn't doubt Napoleon right until the end, until 1814. This was in part down to Napoleon being relatively popular. He was extremely popular even, but in particular, the people really trusted him. He was, after all, a man who had spent the last 12 years winning every battle he fought, so people thought that in Russia he'd slipped up because of the winter, despite it not only being down to the winter, and that the emperor would fix everything.
The Russia campaign marked the start of the decline of the First Empire. 2 years later, the English would win the Battle of Waterloo, and France would be reduced to its pre-1790 frontiers. However, it was the start of a new era for Russia, which found a new place as a major global power. A year later, and this patriotic war had helped Russia forge a national identity that was celebrated by writers and musicians alike.
Being used to success cost us dear in Russia. We had never learned to beat a retreat. During this long debacle, the Emperor was as unsure and undecided on the first day as he was on the last. Fate had so often smiled upon him that he was never able to believe it might betray him.
If you count the survivors from the Battle of the Berezina and the troops stationed in Lithuania, fewer than 30,000 crossed back over the Niemen River. 30,000 out of 500,000 6 months earlier. More than 200,000 soldiers from the Grande Armée died in combat, from the cold, from hunger, or from sickness. More than 150,000 were taken prisoner. On the Russian side, the losses were set at 300,000 dead, half of whom were killed in combat. Sergeant Burgoyne remembers. The Battle of the Berezina was not the end of our struggle. I was taken prisoner a short time later. The Russians decided to send us east, towards Siberia. My unlucky companions thought it better to be held captive and fed potatoes than to die free men from cold or hunger on the march. But I pointed out to them that it would be much better to escape their clutches. Several thousand of us died before reaching Siberia. Others accepted the Tsar's offer to take Russian nationality and settle in this land they had been asked to conquer. As for me, I eventually managed to escape. And in the spring of 1813, I arrived back in France. Peace reigns over a large part of Europe, but France is the theater for some worrying military preparations. Thousands of soldiers are being enrolled, and different army corps are being assembled. But Emperor Napoleon I is saying loud and clear that he does not want another war. In 1811, Napoleon controls Europe, from the Mediterranean to the Niemen River. He is counting on fighting the British with Russian support. Since his victory over Tsar Alexander in Friedland in 1807 and the Treaty of Tilsit, France and Russia are officially allies. But Alexander doesn't support Napoleon's expansionist strategy. And irrespective of their treaties, Alexander allows English merchant ships access to his ports. For Napoleon, Russia's behavior makes it an enemy of France. Armand de Caulaincourt has been French ambassador to St. Petersburg for 4 years. He understands Russia perfectly.
I hear they miss you greatly in St. Petersburg. And they even organized a banquet in honor of your departure. Have you turned into a Russian, Caulaincourt?
You know I've been requesting a transfer back to Paris for 2 years, sir.
2 years, yes. I hope you took advantage of your time there to get to know your friend Alexander. So, why is he refusing to close his ports to the British?
It's not what one might call a declaration.
When we signed the peace treaty in Tilsit 4 years ago, he told me,
I hate the English as much as you do.
And I answered, in that case, we have peace. But he didn't keep his word.
It was you who invaded Germany. You support the Poles, and you are amassing troops on the frontiers during peacetime.
Caulaincourt used to be Napoleon's aide-de-camp. He knows how to gain his trust and his benevolence. But despite his admiration for Napoleon, he won't let himself be blinded. He can clearly see his game, and he fears for France.
Nothing can justify this campaign you're leading so far from Paris. Too many have already died on the battlefield.
Ah, Caulaincourt. You don't understand business.
Russia is vast, and the climate is harsh. They will let you come and wear out your troops forced to march. They won't fight. They will wait for winter.
You no longer have confidence in me. Caulaincourt, don't worry. Look upon the war in Russia as one that makes sense.
War. The word has finally been spoken. Over the following months, Napoleon continues to amass his troops from all 4 corners of Europe, sending them towards the borders of the Russian Empire. Tsar Alexander knows this confrontation is inevitable. He hesitates lengthily between 2 strategies. Should he set out to meet the French or draw them towards Moscow? To thwart the French spies, his plan must remain secret from the majority of the general staff and the Russian people. Napoleon continues to ignore calls for caution. As Caulaincourt noticed, he had gone back down that irresistible path towards his destiny. Day 1 of the campaign, 500,000 men. They speak French in the ranks, but also Italian, German, Polish, Portuguese, and Spanish. It's an army of 20 nations. The First Empire, marching towards its destiny. Napoleon wants a flash campaign, a demonstration of force that will suffice, in his mind, to make the Tsar see sense. He wants to achieve his dream of bringing all the peoples of Europe together as one. They'd been promised they would soon be going home. But beyond the Niemen River, which marks the frontier between Poland and the Russian Empire, they are entering the unknown.
The most important thing to say about the Grande Armée is that it's enormous. The biggest army anyone's ever seen in European history.
The particularity about Napoleon's Grande Armée was that it had very high numbers of civilians.
Some officers, even non-commissioned officers, brought wives and children with them, even mistresses. So the caravan was quite an assorted one.
Some had been with him since the Egyptian campaign. They were the old guard and were the bedrock of the Grande Armée. They trusted and followed this man. To him, he was a star, a genius.
Napoleon is enjoying the start to his campaign. He's made it. He's in the land of the Tsars. In a letter to his wife, Marie-Louise, he reveals his optimism and a certain indifference.
My friend, nothing significant has happened. I'm in good health, but the heat is excessive.
Napoleon's real adversary in terms of ensuring the French domination of Europe was England. His aim was to bring England to its knees and force it to make peace, and within this framework he made a pact with Russia in 1807. In reality, this was an alliance of the strong with the weak. For example, it obliged Russia to declare war on England and to cease all trade with the English. But the Russians were never able to respect this part of the agreement because trade with England was vital to their economy.
Another, even more ideological element involved saying that going to war with Russia was about setting European civilization against Asiatic barbarism, in which Russia was complicit.
If you asked the question of the Russians, they would have said that Napoleon wanted to conquer Russia.
Napoleon wants to win the war quickly. He expects to defeat the Russian army within 2 months, force Alexander to make peace on Napoleon's terms. But he doesn't want to destroy the Russian Empire, and he doesn't want to chase Alexander off his throne. He wants to fight a limited war.
For Alexander, the enemy to defeat is Napoleon, not France, of whose culture and history he's a big fan. He even likes speaking French as much as he does Russian.
Sir, the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen this morning.
Without a declaration of war? Impossible.
The new French ambassador sent a note 2 days ago saying his mission was finished.
2 days ago? Why wasn't I informed?
We didn't think...
That was their declaration of war.
We are ready to fight, sir.
I do not share that view, General.
But?
The Corsican wants a short war, the outcome of which will be determined by one of those victories that made his glorious career. He wants another Austerlitz. And we are going to deprive him of that pleasure.
By refusing to fight? That is an unworthy attitude.
We will leave him to get lost, which will give us time.
Alexander I is a complicated human being. He is, in some senses, a very wily and tough politician. In other ways, he's a very sensitive and easily hurt individual.
Who wouldn't feel inferior to Napoleon in military terms back then? Alexander tried to command armies during the 1805 campaign, and that ended with a terrible catastrophe at the Battle of Austerlitz. So Alexander knows that he isn't a great military mind, and for the first time in Russian history, in 1812, he agreed to not personally command his armies.
Alexander has learned lessons from his 1805 defeat at Austerlitz. Napoleon skillfully let him believe that he only had 40,000 men left, whereas in reality he had double that. Trapped, tricked, and humiliated, the Tsar and his Austrian ally had abandoned 16,000 dead on the battlefield. This was the first in a long series of victories for the Grande Armée, until it entered Russia 7 years later. To put pressure on Alexander, French spies distribute tracts in the villages to cause concern among the Russian countryfolk.
Imperator Napoleon не враг вам, примыкайте нему и будет вам свобода и жизнь лучшая.
30 million peasants are living in slavery. The slightest resistance to the nobility is cruelly repressed. They must be dreaming of their freedom. By promising to abolish servitude, perhaps Napoleon can win their loyalty. But despite their suffering, they are attached to their bits of land. It is their world, and as for these Frenchmen approaching, what do they know? At this early stage in the campaign, it's still impossible for either Napoleon or Alexander to predict what the peasants' reaction will be, and to what extent they can be relied upon. Russia is nothing but a huge uncertainty.
Nobody has invaded Russia for 300 years, and the Russian people compared Napoleon's invasion into their land to the invasion of the Mongols and Tatars in their forebears' day.
Pamphile Nazarov is only 20 years old, but the Tsar needs soldiers to fight Napoleon, whom he presents as the Antichrist. And because Pamphile is young and unmarried, he's been picked out by the village community. Young serfs like him are conscripted with the agreement of their owners, who see this as their contribution to the defense of the Russian motherland.
Да пребудет с тобой Господь Бог, Памфил. Я буду молиться за тебя каждый день.
Enrolled for a period of 25 years, they are then considered free men, if they survive. Pamphile Nazarov will have to learn the tough lesson of becoming a soldier, and soon he will be ready to face the Grande Armée.
When they were enrolled into the army, the serfs were almost certain they'd never see their families and loved ones again. Soldiers' lives were incredibly hard.
The regiment became their family, and that was a fundamental element that also explains the courage with which they fought for these substitute families.
The Russian nobility was very afraid that Napoleon would abolish serfdom in Russia, and this created chaos.
The Grande Armée advances towards Vilnius, but the enemy avoids them and refuses to fight. Napoleon's Imperial Guard finally spots a Russian column. This is their first confrontation and their first hand-to-hand battle. Both sides swear they would rather die than give up an inch of terrain. It's a cruel foretaste of the battles to come. The French easily push back their attackers, which fuels the illusion that the Tsar will capitulate in a matter of days. Sergeant Adrien François Bourgogne, Grenadier of Elite of the Imperial Guard, had participated in all Napoleon's campaigns prior to 1812. To him, this long march is just one more campaign.
Sergeant? Duval? Duval! Oh, my friend! Oh, you turned out well. Are you injured?
It's just a scratch. I've come to give you your share of home. A little wagon taken from a Russian general, and everything it contains. We put it all in Florencia's vehicle. She's our cook. She's been with us since Spain. And I took her under my wing. But I only have honourable intentions. Don't listen to the gossip.
Naturally.
You must eat, little one, to give you strength to fight the Russians. Otherwise, I'll tell the Emperor.
In a touching coincidence, in the same regiment, Bourgogne finds 12 men from Condé-sur-Liscaut, his hometown, some 2,000 kilometers away.
And him? What's wrong with him?
He couldn't stand the artillery. At the first cannon fire, he left his line, and only came back when the battle was over.
The Russian general's wine. You can't say no. You'll toughen up, you'll see. One learns to manage one's fears, anxiety, and pain.
Are you ever afraid?
Me and everyone else. I've been injured twice, and I understand what it means. Being picked by chance and taken away from one's family. The forced marches. The sleepless nights while you await the battle.
If my family hadn't been so poor without possessions on land, I would have had someone to replace me. Him. That's why he's here. A conscript paid for him to take his place. I've never touched a penny of my pay. Look at these souls. They're supposed to last 3 years. What are we doing here? Do you know? Who are we fighting for?
Sergeant Bourgogne chose to make a career of the army. In his eyes, Napoleon is infallible.
Come on, soldier.
He cannot possibly imagine that very soon 11 of the comrades he has just found will lose their lives. The Grande Armée is preparing to enter Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Vilnius was formerly part of Poland before being annexed by Russia, but the Tsar has just abandoned the city. This is good news for the inhabitants of Vilnius and the 30,000 Polish soldiers fighting in the Grande Armée.
When the French entered Vilnius, the Poles and the Polish nobility in particular welcomed the French as their liberators. They thought that Napoleon was giving them their freedom. And better than freedom, he was going to ensure the rebirth of the Polish state.
Alexander was here just a few hours ago. Why would he give me the city without putting up a fight?
Sir, he's doing everything to make this campaign last and to deprive you of a major battle. Time is on his side.
The coward. He has dishonored himself in the eyes of the brave Poles.
Sir, General Balashov, Ambassador for His Imperial Majesty.
Since Peter the Great, no enemy has invaded your land, General Balashov. Yet you allow me to conquer an entire province without even putting up a fight. Are you not ashamed, General?
I can assure you, sir, that the Russians will fight like lions. The Emperor, my master, insists you withdraw your troops.
My brother Alexander is a novice in military affairs. Why did he decide to take on the Supreme Command alone?
He might surprise you.
He will be obliged to ask me for peace before 2 months have passed. We will stay here for a few days to replenish our stores of food, set up hospitals to care for the sick and wounded, and restructure the Lithuanian administration, Berthier, by using the resources of the local elites. We will form a provisional government and proclaim its autonomy.
But nobody will fall for it, sir. The government will be under our control.
Caulaincourt, I didn't ask for your opinion.
Do you intend to declare yourself in favor of Lithuanian independence, to state loud and clear that Poland exists?
There is no question of throwing our alliance with Austria into jeopardy. The Poles will have to wait.
In those conditions, your calls for their patriotism will go unheeded.
Part of Poland still belongs to Austria, and Napoleon needs his Austrian allies to ensure his victory over the Russians.
The Russians did not spontaneously leave when the French arrived. It was a strategy that had been decided upon by the Russian High Command around 1 year before the French entered Russia.
The retreat of the Russian army naturally had to be accompanied by every possible means to slow down the advance of Napoleon's troops. These means included the so-called scorched earth policy that involved destroying all available stocks of food, animal fodder and livestock.
Continuing their pursuit of the evasive Russian army, the Grande Armée leaves Vilnius, and the troops are forced to walk 12 to 25 miles a day, always heading further east. The torrential rain means that every step is a fight with the mud. The Russians have burnt mills and depots, so there's no food for the cavalry. They take rotten straw from the thatched roofs, but the horses die eating it. With no bread and suffering from dysentery and wounds that go unhealed, soon there are thousands of thieves and deserters.
Things started to go wrong from the very first weeks of the campaign. I wouldn't use the word famine, because that's a little excessive, but the first problems of food supplies were emerging.
There were without doubt several tens of thousands of men who were thieving and living off the army without being operational in military terms.
To bring his troops together and foster some kind of cohesion, Napoleon needs the major battle he's been longing for now more than ever. In the distance, they can see a host of tiny lights. They're coming from the Russian army's encampment. It's the Tsar's army. This is the moment they've all been waiting for. Here they are, close by, in his sights. Napoleon's goal is so close now. Tomorrow we'll see the great battle. Just one victory, another Austerlitz, and this war will be over. Sergeant Bourgogne and his men are preparing for the confrontation. They clean their weapons and check their rifles. They cut up sheets in case they're injured. On the battlefield, one must treat one's own wounds. Some are writing their wills, recording their last wishes, but dreaming of seeing their wives and children once more. Others seem carefree, singing or sleeping. On this campaign, Napoleon's losses in terms of men, horses, and equipment are the equivalent of 2 great battles. He needs a victory, and soon.
Sir, you must come, quickly.
I'll be right there, Caulaincourt. Gentlemen.
Napoleon understands that he has been tricked. There will be no battle. The Russians have disappeared without a trace. The army continues on its unremitting way towards Smolensk. The Russian summer is hot, and drinking water is running out. Some battalions only have beer with which to quench their thirst, but they keep going.
Despite all the difficulties during the early days of the campaign, Napoleon has a strategy. He is here to fight. And this strategy almost works because his various troop movements are forcing the Russian army to assemble around the town of Smolensk.
The first artillery is fired at 6 a.m. Napoleon expects to confront the Tsar's armies, but only 20,000 enemy soldiers are present. They've received the order to defend Smolensk, whatever it takes. But behind the ramparts, this wooden town is burning. Men, women, and children who were unable to flee are dying, burned alive, or asphyxiated by smoke inhalation. The city is lost. Napoleon is victorious. He has captured Smolensk, but by blocking him, the defenders of Smolensk have allowed the main part of the Russian army to escape towards Moscow. Some will compare the tragedy of Smolensk with that of Pompeii.
It's like the eruption of Vesuvius. A fine spectacle, is it not, Master Horseman?
It's horrible, sir.
Ha! Just you remember this. A dead enemy's body always smells good. Roman proverb.
Sir, will you permit me to withdraw?
It's the Russians who are stoking the flames while their army runs away, Caulaincourt. Now it will be the honor of your friend, Alexander, to face me at least once. After which we'll be able to make peace, like two champions reconciling after a duel. War is simply politics, Caulaincourt.
And peace will never happen while we're on this side of the Rhine.
Caulaincourt suffers constantly from the pain I inflict upon his friend.
The Tsar is not my friend. I'm more French than many others who only seek to please and flatter you.
Please, calm down. You're addressing the Emperor.
Why should I be silent? I am honored to have done everything to prevent this war. Sir, give me a mission to Spain. Let me leave this...
You are too sensitive, Caulaincourt. You know the esteem I have for you. Alexander simply declares himself against England, and it'll be all over.
And meanwhile?
If he doesn't wish to see me crowned emperor in the Kremlin, he'd better seek to stop me.
Napoleon believed in a battle because he wanted one, and he would win it. He remained convinced that Alexander would soon be asking for peace, and I realized that all I could do was to count on the good ideas that had until that point made me so happy.
The fate of the town was a tragic one because this place, which had once been so magnificent, was completely destroyed by fire, a fire mainly set by the Russians in accordance with their strategy of scorched earth.
Smolensk was a first turning point of the war in that there were widespread civilian deaths, and they were now also victims of this war.
It's considered that it was from the taking of Smolensk that the patriotic war against the French occupier began.
Napoleon the Invader. In Smolensk, he sets up a town council made of Russian citizens, ordered to obey if they do not wish to be punished, and paid in French currency. He orders them to levy a contribution of wheat, livestock, and fodder from the population. These heavy levies serve to foster hatred for the French occupying forces. But the Russians do not understand why Alexander's not fighting back and defending their towns and countryside.
And that triggered a first and very deep crisis of confidence between the Tsar and the Russian population. And also a crisis of confidence inside the Imperial Army itself.
A letter from General Bagration to his friend Yermolov. I am ashamed to wear this uniform. It is killing me. We've been scattered around like pawns, and now we stay here open-mouthed, suffering along our frontiers. It disgusts me so much that it is driving me insane. I'm going to trade my uniform against a peasant smock. Constantly withdrawing makes the Russian soldiers feel like cowards. Their morale is lower than ever.
All these foreign spies. Your army, sir. It includes 1,000 German officers. All these foreigners dictating this dishonorable retreat. Your troops are no longer inspiring confidence.
That is why I brought you all here. I am going to appoint a supreme commander who will be able to unite the army and the people around him. Our victory depends on this nomination.
Я предлагаю генерала Кутузова.
Alexander I didn't like Kutuzov, firstly because his very face reminded Alexander of the defeat at Austerlitz. Because back then, Kutuzov had suggested an option which the Tsar did not follow, and that led to a terrible fiasco.
Sources said that General Kutuzov liked good food and good women. Different generals denounced him to Alexander I, stating that in both his apartment and on the battlefield, Kutuzov had girls dressed as Cossacks, whose job it was to warm up his bed.
But Alexander I was a very modest man, and from that perspective, there was a certain incompatibility in terms of style between the two men.
To lead a war of liberation, a patriotic war, we need a Russian.
In that case, what about General Tomasov?
Kutuzov, sir. He is the oldest. Our best generals, including Bagration and Bennigsen, will agree to serve under him.
He was defeated at Austerlitz.
That doesn't detract from his general popularity. He has just been unanimously elected head of the militias in St. Petersburg and Moscow. His popularity and his exploits in battle speak for him. His bravery goes before him.
General Barclay de Tolly will remain Commander-in-Chief of the 1st Imperial Army, and General Bagration of the 2nd Army. But
Kutuzov will be the new Supreme Commander.
Корсиканец презирает меня. После Аустерлица он считает меня ничтожным генералом. Подожди. А между тем это в его войсках полный разбал боевого духа и военной дисциплины. Ладно, воспользуемся этим. Пошли.
As soon as he's named, Kutuzov brings out the patriotism among his troops. Comrades, he writes, do your duty. Think of the sacrifices of your towns brought down in flames and your children begging for your protection. Think of your Emperor Alexander, your leader, who sees you as the embodiment of his power. While the Tsar's army reorganizes itself in a decisive manner, Napoleon demands his men push themselves ever harder. Rest is not worthy of them. Gusts of wind throw up whirlwinds of torturous burning dust. The speed at which they must travel means many horses are lost. And while typhus tears through the troops, Russian propaganda attacks the most vulnerable. French soldiers, you are forced to march against us. They say you are fighting for peace. Don't believe these perfidious words. You are fighting for the insatiable mission for a leader who does not seek peace, and for whom the blood of young men is a mere trifle. Go home, there's still time. These calls for desertion and harassment aim to weaken the Grande Armée, to be able to attack it better. In 2 months, it shrinks radically, because in addition to the sick, the slain, the injured, and the deserters, some units have had to stay behind to hold Vilnius and Smolensk. But nothing stops their progress. Cavalry and infantry keep moving day and night in the hope of reaching the invisible enemy. Every day, this war seems ever more absurd to Caulaincourt, who rebels. We are destroying each other with no result other than gaining ground. But due to the ground gained, Moscow is now just 3 days' march away. Public opinion has pushed Kutuzov's back to the wall. In Borodino, 75 miles from the sacred city, he tries to stop Napoleon. The terrain is rolling and wooded, which slows down the enemy's progression. Kutuzov establishes his defensive line on the southern bank of the Kolosha River, blocking the route to Moscow. He sets up 4 redoubts. The first and biggest of them is the Raevsky redoubt. Then come the 2 more modest Bagration redoubts, and the last one is the Shevardino redoubt as a frontal buffer. A redoubt is an earth fortification constructed like a hillock where a series of cannon are installed. It's defended from below by a trench of soldiers. Behind, there's a massive concentration of Russian troops.
Kutuzov has placed his forces defensively here. He thinks he's protected behind this river, protected by his redoubts. We'll start first by taking the Shevardino redoubt and the village of Borodino. Then we'll be able to position our troops for the final battle. Our northern armies will be inserted here to prevent the Russian army from surrounding us. There you have it.
$140,000 men in the Grande Armée against 110,000 Russians. 214 infantry battalions against 180. 317 cavalry squadrons against 20 Cossack regiments. 587 cannon against 624. The sound of cannon fire creates great joy for the French and a strange relief, because they're certain this time that the Russians have not decamped. The two armies are to fight in two highly strategic areas: the village of Borodino on the road to Moscow and the Shevardino Redoubt, an essential barrier in the Russian defensive line. In less than an hour, more than 10,000 men are wounded or killed. This is a bloody prelude to the main battle, an attack that will allow the Grande Armée to tackle the Russian resistance. Even when they're wounded, far from calling for help, they refuse to give up and seem determined to die where they fought. But their bravery is not enough. The French take the Shevardino Redoubt. Despite heavy losses, the first step in Napoleon's plan is a success. Each army dresses its wounds. The Russians are reinforcing their defensive lines, and the Raevsky and Bagration redoubts in particular. Kutuzov is organizing a solemn procession with the Virgin of Smolensk. Pamphil Nazarov, like his companions, prays for divine protection. His thoughts turn to his family. But he cannot say this, as one must be ready to die for God, the Tsar, and Russia. The Russians have never prayed with as much fervor as they did today, wrote the poet Glinka. In these hours, our hearts and souls are having secret conversations with divinity. While the enemy puts itself in God's hands, the Grande Armée, which has never lost faith in Napoleon, waits impatiently for the next morning. The Emperor has slept badly.
Caulaincourt. Thank you.
He went to bed at 3 a.m., worried that the Russians might disappear once again. But when he emerges from his tent, he is confident once again. The first light of dawn reminds him of the sunshine at Austerlitz. The previous evening, he redrew his battle plans. He wants to defeat the southern flank of the enemy forces, to attack the redoubtable fortifications constructed by the Russians, and the great Raevsky Redoubt in particular. The Emperor's Imperial Guard will stay back, ready to intervene if necessary.
Soldiers, this is the battle we wished for so long. Now, our victory depends on you. We need it. It will bring you wealth, land, and ensure we will soon be home. Fight as you fought in Austerlitz. Your efforts will go down in history, and they will say, he was there at that great battle at the gates of Moscow.
For 10 hours, the armies fight hand to hand. One forgets one's fear under the deluge of bullets, cannonballs, and shells. One barely notices one's comrades as they fall, struck down at point-blank range. The Russians will call it the Battle of Borodino. The French will talk of the Battle of Moskova. Positions are taken, lost, taken back, and lost again. The 2nd Cavalry Corps of General Montbrun must now charge to the right of the Raevsky Redoubt. Montbrun is looking for the right position from which to attack. He heads off on a reconnaissance mission by horse, but unfortunately is hit in the chest by a cannonball. Napoleon then decides to replace him with Auguste de Caulaincourt, the brother of Armand. The Russian infantry, destabilized by the fatal wounding of General Bagration, pulls itself together and redoubles its efforts to regain lost ground. The actors in this carnage speak of hell, of a burning sky, of the apocalypse, and cannon spitting death. Caulaincourt suddenly has a terrible premonition. At 3 p.m., his brother, Auguste, at the head of the 5th Regiment of Cuirassiers, supported by 2 divisions and 2 infantry battalions, makes an assault on the Great Raevski Redoubt. The Russians must beat a retreat. The wounded beg to be put out of their misery and be relieved of their terrible suffering. The Russians abandon their positions, but their army has not been annihilated. The battle was hellish, but if there is to be a winner, there must also be a loser.
I think it's very difficult to evaluate the results of the Battle of Borodino, because Napoleon and Kutuzov each had their own objectives, and neither Napoleon nor Kutuzov achieved them. Napoleon's aim was to totally defeat the Russian army. Kutuzov's aim was to stop the French and to protect Moscow.
What did it mean to win a battle at that time? One might say that the winner is the army that is in control of the battlefield. If that's the case, then there was a clear winner at the Battle of Moskova, because the Russians withdrew and the French stayed in control of the terrain. Therefore, Napoleon won the Battle of Moskova. It is true that in strategic terms, the Battle of Moskova weakened the Grand Army, and that's why the Russians claim it as a victory. Everyone might agree if we said that the French won the Battle of Moskova and the Russians didn't lose the Battle of Borodino.
It's a disappointing victory for Napoleon, and so costly in terms of human life. But the Imperial Guard, the elite of the Grande Armée, stayed back. Sergeant Bourgogne thus watched the battle from a distance, unlike so many of his compatriots who found themselves in the front line. Napoleon was prudent, too prudent perhaps, and didn't want to take the risk of weakening his guard. But if he had sent Bourgogne and his men into the melee, the victory might perhaps have been greater. Lives might have been saved. Bourgogne's companions might have gone home safe and sound. So many heroes, soldiers, officers, and generals. Caulaincourt will never forget that gruesome day.
We will triumph, or I shall kill myself, were the last words Auguste said to me. He had led the decisive charge against the Great Redoubt. Did he have the time to enjoy it before being killed by an enemy bullet? For the Emperor, France had lost one of its best officers, but I had lost a brother. He was 35 years old.
During this dreadful day, 120,000 cannonballs and 300,000 cartridges were fired, resulting in a terrible loss of human life. 45,000 Russians died, were injured or gone, more than a third of the troops. Napoleon lost 28,000 men. This slaughter pushes the medical services to their limits. Many injured people are left on the battlefield without help. In the Grande Armée, there is one doctor and one pharmacist for every 600 soldiers. 45 surgeons care for victims on both sides. It takes less than 4 minutes to amputate a leg. 10,000 wounded beyond help are left in the surrounding villages where most of them will die. Napoleon then waits for the following day's hostilities. But Kutuzov has another idea.
Why did Kutuzov not continue the battle the following day as he had promised? At the end of the battle, he gave orders to attack Napoleon's troops the following morning. But later on that night, he gave an order that was totally contrary: to withdraw. The most likely reason was that he had received information in the meantime regarding losses in the Russian army. And these losses were terrible.
Kutuzov spends a long time with his generals, weighing up the pros and cons of a new fight, eventually admitting that his troops aren't strong enough to stop Napoleon, and that it will be better to spare them and take some time to find reinforcements. "420,000 soldiers crossed the Niemen River 3 months earlier. Now, just half of them remain. They came from France, Spain, and Italy. They'd traveled over 2,500 miles, crossed the Alps or the Pyrenees, and traveled through Germany, Poland, and Western Russia. At last, they think they're going to get the rest they desperately need. But Napoleon remains convinced that the arrival of the Grande Armée at the gates of Moscow will be the coup de grâce that will force Alexander to negotiate. Sergeant Bourgogne remembers. After having crossed through a big forest, we finally caught our first glimpse of Moscow. And in moments like these, one forgets everything. The dangers, the fatigue, the comrades lost, and only one thing counts: the pleasure of entering the promised land. But Napoleon, who dreamed of entering the city as a conquering hero, like in Vienna and Berlin, discovers that Moscow has been abandoned, and no public figure is going to come and hand him the keys to the city. Only those who had neither the money nor the time to flee remain. Napoleon moves into the Kremlin with his guard and his services in attendance. His generals occupy the luxury homes of the Moscow nobility.
Where are our divisions?
Sir, fires have been started all across the city. It seems that it was the Russians...
No, I don't believe it. These barbarians can't possibly be so crazy as to destroy Moscow.
There are no fire engines left. They took them all.
Then find the arsonists. And we'll hang them when we do.
First, they believe the fires are accidental, set by drunken soldiers celebrating their first night in Moscow. But it soon becomes clear that these fires are no accident. Dozens of arsonists are scattered around the city. Who are they? And who is giving orders to create this inferno?
Sergeant, I think we found some treasure.
Don't get ahead of yourself.
Get down!
Kutuzov chose to abandon Moscow to avoid a new confrontation and to reorganize his troops. That is why the Governor-General of the city, Count Rostopchin, left to his own devices, orders reprisals by burning warehouses, storerooms, and palaces. Nothing is to be left to the invading forces.
Is everyone okay?
Yes, Sergeant.
Sergeant Bourgogne remembers. When the explosion happened, we thought we were dead, annihilated under the debris. The Russians didn't care how they tried to destroy us.
Are you wounded, Sergeant?
It's nothing.
Where are we? This is where we should sleep.
You're too ugly and you smell too bad to sleep in a palace. Sergeant, come and look. What do we do with it, Sergeant?
We take it. Look out! It's all collapsing. Let's get out of here. Come on.
Danger is everywhere. Napoleon's Grande Armée has fallen into a burning trap. Surrounded by flames and blinded, they still dream of victory.